Not all gimmicks are created equal. No, on occasion, a character is developed for someone which, for one reason or another, just doesn't work. Yes, WWE have had their fair share of stinkers over the years. But just what are the worst of every year of the 21st century? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with the worst character of 2000, the Good Father. Now, if we're talking about the late 90s, then Charles Wright would not be getting the nod for worst gimmick in WWF, as back then he was getting hugely over as the Godfather, a wrestling pimp which perfectly fit in with the edgy product the company was putting out back then. But come 2000, that would all have changed, as after parents groups got involved, Vince McMahon would be forced to tone down some of his more outrageous characters, with the one who got hit the hardest arguably being the Godfather. Yes, now, rather than being a pimp, the Good Father, as he was from this point onwards known, would become a member of the moral crusader group The Right to Censor, with this taking away everything about his character which made him stand out and instantly turned him into just another guy in a suit. But if we move over to 2001 next, we'll find a character getting worse by doing the opposite, getting wackier. That's right, it's time for us to talk about Perry Saturn and Moppy. Of course, it wasn't like Perry Saturn had a great character in WWF prior to this. No, during 2000 his role had pretty much been to be the fourth most important member of the Radicals. So you'd think that giving him anything would make for a more interesting spot on TV then, right? Wrong, because this was one specifically designed to bury the Cleveland native after he got in trouble for shooting on an opponent during a match. What was specifically involved in the gimmick here? Well, the idea was that, after sustaining one too many blows to the head, Saturn fell in love with a mop. No, you didn't hear us wrong, that's literally what happened. Obviously then, this was not well received at the time, and it's still looked back upon poorly today. But is it looked back upon as poorly as our entry for 2002? Well, let's find out by looking at that right now. Planet Stasiak. Now, 2002 was a strange time for WWE. Really, it was a time of transition, as with so many people joining the promotion following the death of both WCW and ECW, and with the Attitude Era ending, it felt like both the roster and the company themselves were trying to figure out who they were for this new century. Needless to say then, this meant a lot of new gimmicks, and of those gimmicks, the worst was undoubtedly Planet Stasiak. How could it be anything else, though, when this gimmick of Shawn Stasiak's was that he seemed to, for no particular reason at all, think he was an alien all of a sudden, an alien from the mysterious Planet Stasiak. Truly, this was about as goofy as it got back then, and it did not get over with fans for obvious reasons. And that wasn't the only gimmick of the time period which failed to get over, because the same thing could be said about our entry for 2003, Mr. America. Now, Mr. America is something which might have seemed like a good idea on the face of things, but in practice, it just ended up being a bit of a mess. And that's because, like with Planet Stasiak, it was all just a little bit too goofy for the audience by the time the Ruthless Aggression era came around. Sure, there were fun elements to seeing Hulk Hogan pretend to be a masked mystery man in order to get one over on Vince McMahon, despite it being blatantly obvious who he was, but overall, it was just a little too out there. Yes, here was an example of trying to milk a little too much wackiness out of the Hulk Hogan character. Maybe if this one had come along during the 80s, it would have been better received, but that was not to be in 2003. And 2004 would be no different when it came to a gimmick which might have worked better under different circumstances, as that was the year of Eugene. Yes, when it comes to Eugene, there were some good things to come out of the gimmick, especially some fans with learning disabilities and cognitive impairments who found in the character someone they could relate to. But for the most part, much like Mr. America, things just got a little too goofy at times. And this was a gimmick which required a delicate touch, being that it was one which featured a man who had some kind of developmental disorder. Unfortunately though, one thing you could not accuse wrestling of being in 2004 was subtle or delicate in the way it portrayed such things. And so for that reason, there were as many people who were turned off by the whole character. And it was a similar situation from the audience which caused our worst WWE gimmick of 2005 to fail, Kerwin White. If it's not white, it's not right. That was the motto of Kerwin White, a character which saw Hispanic star Chavo Guerrero decide to change up his racial identity during the mid-2000s and start acting more Caucasian. We shouldn't have to tell you why this one failed then. It wasn't like WWE didn't soon realize it was hitting on all the wrong nerves, and that's why it would be so short-lived. And that's why, once he disappeared not too long after his debut, he'd never be referenced again, with Chavo instead just returning to his old character and pretending the whole thing never happened. But sadly for our next entry, few people will ever forget his run as the worst WWE gimmick of 2006, Pirate Paul Burchill. Now, when it comes to this one, it's still what most people associate Paul Burchill with to this day. And the reason for that was because it was so bad, it was worthy of the halls of WrestleCrap. What led to Burchill suddenly becoming a swashbuckler on WWE TV here? Well, Pirates of the Caribbean. More specifically, Johnny Depp's portrayal of Captain Jack Sparrow in this franchise. Yes, this was the period when you couldn't leave the house on Halloween without seeing at least 20 guys dressed as Jack Sparrow. So it's easy to see why WWE tried to jump on the bandwagon too. The only problem was their version of a pirate was less an iconic pop culture moment and more bottom of the barrel, which is why it would never return again once it was axed soon thereafter, allegedly on the orders of Vince McMahon himself. But what of 2007? Well, that year the worst gimmick in WWE would move over to another comedy act. Who are we talking about here? Why, Little Boogeyman, of course. Now, true connoisseurs of wrestling will be all too aware that the Boogeyman, popular WWE comedy act of the mid to late 2000s, was coming to get ya. But what's gone forgotten by some today is that there was a point when the Boogeyman had a sidekick, a mini-me if you will. That's right, it was in 2007 that, seeing the popularity of the character with kids, Vince McMahon decided to add a dink to Boogeyman's doink with the aptly named Little Boogeyman. Not that Little Boogeyman did much on screen, of course. No, like with Dink, he was pretty much just a mascot, and not even a particularly popular one as fans really didn't take to him. Would the same flaws be the thing which sunk our entry for the worst WWE gimmick of 2008 though? No, that would be sunk by completely different circumstances, as that one was Bam Neely. Okay, we understand if a lot of you have forgotten all about Bam Neely by now, as he really wasn't a character which left much of a footprint behind. But then part of the reason for that was because he was mostly cordoned off away on the WWE CW brand. Sure, he was technically a part of Edge's La Familia stable, but with him mostly playing the role of Chavo Guerrero's bodyguard on the C brand, it didn't exactly give him much opportunity to shine. Rather, all it did was hasten the demise of a gimmick which was always doomed to failure anyway, as, to be perfectly honest, it was pretty dry at the best of times, with Bam not exactly radiating charisma during his run in WWE. No, whenever he was standing behind Chavo while he cut a promo in the ring, you could pretty much feel the energy leaving the room, and that's why he'd be dropped soon thereafter, like so many of the other gimmicks we've looked at today were. And that pattern is going to continue with our next subject, unfortunately, the undisputed worst WWE gimmick of 2009, Kizarny. Really though, there should have been absolutely no one who was surprised when Kizarny failed to get over toward the end of the 2000s, as the whole joke was so one note. It was a guy who was named after, and who spoke in, Carney speak, the kind of speech which wrestlers used to engage in back in the day when they wanted to try to keep the secrets of the business just that, a secret. It wasn't like there was much else to this one, and to be honest, it wasn't like the Carney speak joke was even one that the majority of the audience understood anyway. So for that reason, its erasure from history today is understandable. And that's not the only gimmick of this era which has pretty much been erased from history today, as the same thing could be said about our choice for worst gimmick of 2010, Lucky Cannon. Okay, this is another one which it would be very easy to forget ever existed today. So if you have, we understand. What was Lucky Cannon's character? Well, it was that during the early seasons of NXT, back when that show was in its original game show format, a guy was introduced whose whole gimmick was that he was lucky. Yes, that really was the long and short of it. He just thought that destiny was on his side. Unfortunately though, that wasn't enough to see Cannon win the tournament at any point, or make his way up to the main roster for a run there. And that soon left him to be relegated to the bargain bin of history. But our entry for the worst WWE gimmick of 2011 certainly isn't one which has been forgotten to history today. No, unfortunately we still all remember the horror that was heel Michael Cole. Now, a heel commentator in itself isn't necessarily a bad idea. No, people like Bobby Heenan, Jesse Ventura, and more recently Nigel McGuinness have all done very good jobs in this role over the years. But when it came to Michael Cole in 2011, all he served to do was grate on the audience. To be fair though, that was because his heel character took up so much screen time, with him even getting a featured role at WrestleMania 27 when he challenged and then beat Jerry Lawler. Sure, there was more to it than just that, the coal mine, the obnoxious calling of matches, but really, the thing which sent everyone over the edge was the fact that so much of the showcase of the Immortals that year was dedicated to Cole stinking out the joint and then having the gall to walk away with the victory. Honestly, it's no wonder fans were all out on this gimmick here. And that's why it has to be our choice for worst gimmick of 2011, just as our choice for worst WWE gimmick of 2012 absolutely has to be the often forgotten in 2025, Lord Tensai. What went wrong with Lord Tensai? Well, for one, there was the fact that anyone with a pair of functioning eyes could immediately tell it was Attitude Era star Albert. So when WWE attempted to rebrand him as a mysterious fighter from the Far East, people saw through it right away, forcing the company to then acknowledge that yes, this was the former A-Train, but he was a changed man since venturing over to Japan. Even then though, this was not enough to get fans on board because while Tensai had indeed found some success over in Japan during the turn of the decade, he was always going to be that guy from X Factor to them. So this new gimmick just didn't have any effect. And it only got worse once the big man joined up with Brodus Clay before the year was out to embark upon the dreaded dancing gimmick. But let's move away from that for now and over to 2013 instead, as this year we have two entrants for worst gimmick of the year, in Primo and Epico, Los Matadores. Now Primo and Epico had been a fine mid-card tag team in WWE for a couple of years prior to this, but after hitting something of a glass ceiling, their bosses felt they needed a refresh of character in order to help them reach that next level in 2013. The only problem was, the characters they were given here were that of Los Matadores, two Spanish bullfighters. Yes, it was all a little bit too cartoony, so for that reason, even if they were involved to some degree in WeLC, one of the more entertaining comedy matches of that year, and even if they did have their own personal bull in El Torito, Los Matadores just didn't hit with fans. No, this was an example of something which should have very much been left on the drawing board of the writer's room rather than make its way to TV. And 2013 wasn't the only year when an apparent animal was involved in the worst WWE gimmick of the year, as 2014 would be the year where the bunny represented the absolute lowlight of WWE. No, we're not talking about the Easter Bunny here, rather we're talking about the character who served as a mascot of sorts to Adam Rose back in 2014. Basically, back then, Rose was WWE's resident party animal, and this led to him going everywhere with his exotic express of rosebuds, one of whom was a mystery person in a bunny costume. When it came to the bunny, however, they were not happy to be Rose's second for long, and that eventually led to them standing up to their leader and eventually even stealing a pin from him at that year's Survivor Series. Really, it seemed like the whole thing was leading to a reveal of who was under the mask. And then, for reasons which were never clear, the whole thing just got dropped with no explanation, leaving this one to end like a bit of a wet fart. For as bad as that one was, though, it has nothing on the worst WWE character of 2015. One so bad, it greatly contributed toward the guy playing it eventually leaving the company. Who are we talking about this time? Who else but the infamous Stardust? Come on now, it's rare that a gimmick comes along which is so bad, it indirectly helps a whole new challenger company to form. But that's exactly what happened with Cody Rhodes, because in 2015, he was given the tall task of getting Stardust over, basically a Temu version of his older brother Goldust's gimmick. Honestly, this one flopped hard then, as it was all a little too cartoonish, and playing the part upset Cody so much, he'd leave WWE. Sure, he has since returned to WWE, but no one's clamoring for the American Nightmare to wear the face paint again now, because very few look back on the disaster that was Stardust fondly today. In the hands of anyone else, this could have been a complete career killer. Thankfully, though, it wasn't. No, Cody would ultimately go on to thrive to a higher degree than perhaps anyone else in the wrestling industry right now. It's just a shame the same can't be said for our next subjects then, the tag team who have the dishonor of having two separate gimmicks being amongst the worst of the year for WWE. Yes, we're back to talking about Primo and Epico again, or as they were known back in 2016, the Shining Stars. What made the Shining Stars fail in the same way that Los Matadores had a few years prior? Well, it was just all round a gimmick that had nothing going for it. And that's because, while the Spanish bullfighter characters had been pretty lame, they were nothing compared to a pair of travel agents. That's right, this one effectively saw Primo and Epico play the role of two guys inviting fans to go to Puerto Rico and enjoy all of their beautiful beaches. Not exactly the makings of a great gimmick, is it? No, this was less Undertaker and more that fake version of Undertaker from 1994. Yes, trying to boost tourism for their home country didn't exactly make for much in the way of exciting TV. And that's exactly why it was WWE's worst gimmick of 2016, but what about 2017? Well, that year, the dishonor of worst gimmick would have to go to the notoriously bad Emelina. Now, Emma was someone who had found some degree of success in WWE prior to 2017, mostly down in NXT, where her matches with Paige had helped to trigger some of the early signs of the company's women's evolution, which was to come. And even on the main roster, while she was never a huge star there, she found a niche in being a comedic sidekick to Santino Marella for a while. But then Vince McMahon decided she needed a refresh, and that was where Emelina came into the picture. What was the idea with this one? Well, it was that Emma was going to undergo a glamorous makeover, one which would see her be off of TV for a while as video packages hyped up her return. The only problem was these packages ended up going on for a comically long period of time. And once they eventually led to Emelina debuting, the gag would be that she immediately left again so she could go back to being Emma once more, making the whole thing completely pointless. What a surprise fans didn't like this one then, eh? Almost as much of a surprise as fans not buying into the worst WWE gimmick of 2018, No Way Jose. Okay, to explain the No Way Jose character, we have to explain the idea of a performer who could be described as a meme wrestler. Someone who gets over as a meme for one very specific thing like a dance, catchphrase, or comedy bit. Fandango, Danhausen, Joe Hendry. These are all examples of acts which fit that bill. And back in 2018, Jose was very much part of that class, as his gimmick was that he would lead a conga line down to the ring, often in the middle of other people's matches. As you would expect then, while this was fun for a week or two, the novelty quickly wore off. And that led to No Way soon falling down the pecking order even more, to the point that he was barely even a factor on WWE TV at all anymore. Could more have been done with this gimmick? Not really. No, by its very nature, it was always going to have a shelf life. And that means come 2019, this dancing wrestler would no longer be in a position to call himself the worst WWE gimmick of the year. Rather, that honor would instead go to Shorty G. Now, Chad Gable is a very good wrestler, no one's going to deny that. And in recent years, he's shown himself to be a pretty decent promo too, but few could have overcome a gimmick as bad as the one he was saddled with back in 2019, the one which went by the name of Shorty G. Why was that? Well, because the whole idea behind this one was that Chad Gable was short. Yeah, that was really all there was to it. So it's understandable that fans weren't into it then. Hell, most fans just saw this as a waste of Gable's talents, as even if he wasn't 6'4", he was still better than most people on the roster. Honestly, the whole thing just felt completely out of touch with where the audience was in 2019. So thank God things have gone better for Chad in recent years then, as he's been able to leave Shorty G and the stink it created around him behind. It's just a shame the same can't be said for our next subject, the worst WWE gimmick of 2020, Retribution. Yes, this one should be familiar to anyone who was watching wrestling back during the lockdown, as it's since gone down in infamy for being one of the biggest misses WWE has had in their long history. What made Retribution flop so hard? Well, despite trying to present them as an invading force akin to the New World Order, the fivesome made up of Mace, T-Bar, Slapjack, Reckoning, and Retaliation just came off like B-tier Power Rangers villains instead. But with names like that, and with the ridiculous outfits they were being asked to wear, how could they come across as anything different? Really, it's no surprise this one flopped in record time. So much would this one be hated by the audience, in fact, in the years since, some of that stink has remained on each of the people who were involved. And if that isn't the sign of a truly bad gimmick, we don't know what is. That said, it could always be worse. It could be the worst WWE gimmick of 2021 we're talking about here, the infamous Gladiator rebranding of Karrion Kross. Now, when Karrion Kross first joined the WWE roster as part of NXT a year or so prior to this, there was definitely a feeling amongst some fans that he had the potential to go very far on the main roster, as he checked all the obvious boxes for the company. Hell, this is exactly why he'd end up becoming a two-time NXT champion by the time his run on the developmental brand was over. Unfortunately for Kross though, once he was called up to Raw, he'd be a victim of one of the worst makeovers ever seen. What made this one so bad? Well, it took the cool entrance and valet away from him, two of the things which had helped to get him over down in NXT, and left him with nothing but a weird Roman Gladiator outfit. Seriously, it would be like taking Roman Reigns and rebranding him as a pig farmer instead of a mob boss. It just went against everything he'd already established about himself. And then, to make matters worse, Karrion would lose his debut Raw match to Jeff Hardy in just 2 minutes, with this instantly signaling to the audience that he was just another jobber. But at least Karrion Kross can rest easy knowing that he wasn't the only person given a bad gimmick during the early 2020s. No, 2022 gave us another whopper as it happened, in the form of Scripts. That's right, Scripts, a character which was supposed to represent a big-time rebrand of former SmackDown sommelier, Reggie, but which ended up just representing a major regression as it saw him turn into what we think was supposed to be some sort of lucha superhero-style character. The only problem was the ring gear was so bad here it made him look like he'd just left a Halloween costume shop after picking up the first thing he saw on the racks. Needless to say then, fans went mild for this one when it was first introduced down in NXT during 2022. Sure, the goal here might have been Rey Mysterio, but in execution it ended up about as far away from that as you could possibly get. But what of 2023? Would Scripts take the title of worst WWE gimmick of that year too? No, he wouldn't, as that year this would move over to our next subject, Quincy Elliott. Now it's hard to say what Quincy Elliott's character was supposed to be exactly. Yes, they presented themselves as the super diva, so there was clearly some RuPaul energy to the entire thing. But rather than going all in with the drag queen stylings, it all just felt a little bit half-baked, and so no one really took to this new gimmick. Really, if anything, it just felt a little too heavily reliant on old stereotypes, and that meant no one could connect with it in any real way. For this reason then, Quincy was not long for WWE, as after only a few months down in NXT, they'd be cut from their contract, with a major reason being that the gimmick wasn't hitting. Sure, there were other reasons too, including reported backstage issues, but even if that hadn't been the case, we're pretty sure this idea was always destined to be a flop anyway, as it wasn't something which was properly drawn and defined. And that was to some degree the issue with our choice for worst WWE gimmick of 2024 as well, the one, the only, Wyatt Six. Now, while the Wyatt Six had everyone on their sides when they first debuted on WWE TV in 2024 on account of the whole thing being done in tribute to the late Bray Wyatt, it quickly became apparent this was not going to match up to the level of something like The Fiend. And the reason for that is partially because the whole thing was never really gone into full force. No, whenever this fivesome were on TV, which was very sporadically, it wasn't completely clear what their goals were or how fans were supposed to feel about them. Were they a group of supernatural villains as they had been presented on night one? Or were they a lovable babyface stable honoring a fallen soldier as they were presented soon thereafter? Or were they even a more generic mid-card heel act as they've been presented to audiences as of late? Really, it's hard to get too invested in the whole thing when WWE doesn't seem to know what they want out of the stable. And that's not the only somewhat directionless heel act which has struggled in WWE over the last year or two, as the exact same thing could be said about our choice for the worst WWE gimmick of 2025, heel John Cena. Yeah, after years of asking for the mythical John Cena heel turn, WWE fans finally got this in 2025, and it turned out to be a bit of a wash. Why was this? Well, while the initial turn was great, the whole thing quickly fell apart when Big Match John's reasoning for turning saw him just cut one of those tired old "you people booed me" promos, despite the fact fans hadn't been booing him for years by then. Honestly, this was a case of the company having a great idea, but then things going off the rails as for the next several months, heel John Cena meandered on, never really justifying his existence. And yes, while The Rock not being there certainly added to the frustrations over the heel turn, even if the Great One had been present, this was still a bit of a write-off by the end. So that's why for our money, he has to be considered the worst WWE gimmick of 2025, with this putting him right up there with everyone else we've looked at today as a complete character miss.